great shark hunt by Hunter Thompson. He's got a article in here called Southern City with Northern Problems, and it talks about Louisville. So this is Hunter S. Thompson on Louisville, 1963, about the race relations in Louisville, 1963. Kino's Cafe, Q-U-I-N-O, is on Market Street, 2 blocks up the hill from the river in the heart of Louisville's legal and financial district. And often in long, damp Ohio Valley afternoons, a lot of people who might ordinarily avoid such a place will find themselves staying at Quino's White Formica counter, drinking a Fairs or a Falls City beer and eating a genuine 20-cent beer cheese sandwich while they skim through an early edition of the Louisville Times. If you stand at the counter and watch the street, you'll see off-duty cops and courthouse loafers visiting farmers with 5 children and a pregnant wife in the cab of a pickup truck, and the well-fed collection of lawyers and brokers in 2-button suits and cordovan shoes. You also see quite a few Negroes, some of them also wearing business suits and cordovan shoes. Louisville takes pride in its race relations, and the appearance of well-dressed Negroes in the courthouse city district does not raise any eyebrows. This city, Louisville, is known as Derby Town and the gateway to the South, has done an admirable job in breaking down the huge and traditional barriers between the black man and the white. Here in the mint julep country, where the Negro used to be viewed with all the proprietary concern that men lavish on a good coon hound, treat him fine when he works well, but when he acts lazy and no count, beat him until he hollers. The integration of the races has made encouraging headway. Racial segregation has been abolished in nearly all white public places. Negroes entered the public schools in 1956 with so little trouble that the superintendent of schools was moved to write a book about it called The Louisville Story. Since then, restaurants, hotels, parks, movie theaters, stores, swimming pools, bowling alleys, and even business schools have been opened up to Negroes. As a clincher, the city recently passed an ordinance that outlaws racial discrimination in any public accommodation. This has just about done the deed. Out of 99 establishments tested by NAACP workers, there are only 4 complaints, 2 from the East End Bar. Mayor William Callinger, whose progressive Republican administration has caused even Democrats to mutter with admiration, spoke for most of his fellow citizens recently when he said, "The stories of violence in other cities should make us proud to live in Louisville. We enjoy national prestige for sane and sensible race relations." All this is true, and so it is all the more surprising to visit Louisville and find so much evidence to the contrary. Why, for instance, does a local Negro leader say integration here is a farce? Why also has a local Negro minister urged his congregation to arm themselves? Why do Louisville Negroes bitterly accuse the Federal Urban Renewal Project of creating de facto segregation? Why can't a Negro take out a mortgage to buy a home in most white neighborhoods? And why is there so much bitterness in the remarks of Louisvillians, both black and white? Integration is for poor people, one hears. They can't afford to buy their way out of it. Or in 10 years, downtown Louisville will be as black as Harlem. What is apparent in Louisville is that the Negro has won a few crucial battles. Instead of making the breakthrough he expected, he has come up against segregation's second front, where the problems are not mobs and unjust laws, but customs and traditions. The Louisville Negro, having taken the first basic steps, now face a far more subtle thing than the subtle yes or no that his brothers are still dealing with in most parts of the South. In this extent, Louisville has integrated itself right out of the South and now faces problems more like those of a northern or midwestern city. The white power structure has given way in the public sector only to entrench itself more firmly in the private. And the Negro, especially the educated Negro, feels that his victories are hollow and his progress is something he reads about in the newspapers. The outlook for Louisville's Negroes may have improved from separate but equal to equal but separate, and it still leaves a great deal to be desired. The white power structure, as defined by local Negroes, means the men who run the town, the men who control banking and industry and insurance, who pay big taxes and lend big money and head important civic committees. Their names are not well known to the average citizen, and when they get publicity at all, it is likely to be in the society sections of the one-owner local press. During the day, their headquarters is the Pendennis Club on downtown Walnut Street, where they meet for lunch, squash, steamed bass, and cocktails. If you want to get things done in this town, according to a young lawyer very much on the way up, you better belong to the Pendennis. On evenings and weekends, the scene shifts to the Louisville Country Club far out in the East End, or clear across the county line to Harmony Landing, where good polo and good whiskey push business out of sight, if not out of mind. Anybody who pays dues to at least two of these clubs can consider himself a member in good standing of the white power structure. This is a group that determines by quiet pressure, direct action, and sometimes even default just how far and fast Louisville will move toward integration. Among themselves, it is clear they are no more integrated now than they were 10 years ago, and they are not likely to be at any time in the near future. They have, for the most part, taken their sons and daughters out of the public schools or moved to suburban areas where the absence of Negroes makes integration an abstract question. The only time they deal actively with Negroes is when they give the maid a ride to the bus stop, get their shoes shined, or attend some necessary but unpleasant confrontation with a local Negro spokesman. Despite an ancient conditioning to prejudice, however, they are in the main a far more progressive and enlightened lot than their counterparts in Birmingham, or even in a lot of cases than their own sons and daughters. There's a feeling in liberal circles, especially in New York and Washington, that the banner of racial segregation has little appeal to younger generation. Murray Kempton has written that the special challenge of the 1960s is how to appease the Negro without telling the poor white. But neither theory appears to apply in Louisville. Some of the bitterest racists in town belong to the best families, and no Mississippi dirt farmer rants more often against the niggers than do some of Louisville's young, up-and-coming executives just a few years out of college. At Bars, B-A-U-E-R-S, a fashionable pine-paneled tavern much frequented by the young bucks of the social set, the sentiment is overwhelmingly anti-Negro. Late in the evening, some of the habitués find themselves carried along in the confusion of drink and good fellowship toward Magazine Street in the heart of the colored section. There at Oliver's and Big John's and the Diamond Horseshoe, the auction goes on until dawn, and a carload of jovial racists are as welcome as anybody else, black or white. The Negroes suspend their resentment, the whites suspend their prejudice, and everybody enjoys the music and the entertainment. But there is little or no mingling, and the activities of the night are quite separate from those of the day. You get a feeling after a while that the young are not really serious either about denouncing the nigger for not knowing his place, or about ignoring the color line for nocturnal visits to Magazine Street. Magazine Street. Both are luxuries that will not last, and the young are simply enjoying them while they can. Mayor Calger likes to say, people are different here. We get along with each other because we don't like trouble. Others will tell you that Louisville has no overt racial problem because the greatest commitment of the majority of white citizens is simply to maintain the status quo, whatever it happens to be. In such a society, of course, it might be argued that almost anything can happen as long as it happens slowly and inconspicuously without getting people stirred up, all of which naturally frustrates the Negro who said that he wants his freedom now. If the Negro were patient, and who can tell him he should be, he would have no problem. But freedom now is not in the white Louisville vocabulary. A good example of the majority viewpoint shows up in the housing situation, which at the moment is inextricably linked with urban renewal. As it happens, the urban renewal project centers mainly in the downtown Negro district, and most of the people who have to be relocated are black. It also happens that the only part of town to which Negroes can move is the West End, an old and tree-shaded neighborhood bypassed by progress and now in the throes of a selling panic because of the Negro influx. There is a growing fear shared by whites and Negroes alike that the West End is becoming a black ghetto. Frank Stanley Jr., the Negro leader who said integration here is a farce. Frank Stanley Jr., he said that integration is a farce in 1963. He blames urban renewal for the problem. All they're doing is moving the ghetto intact from the middle of town to the West End. Urban renewal officials reply to this by claiming the obvious, that their job is not to desegregate Louisville, but to relocate people as quickly and advantageously as possible. Sure, they can move to the West End, says one official. Where else can they go? It is a fact that whites are moving out of the West End as fast as they can. A vocal minority is trying to stem the tide, but there's hardly a block without a for sale sign, and some blocks show as many as 10, yet there is hardly any race prejudice in the West End. Talk to a man with his house for sale, and you'll be given to understand that he's not moving because of any reluctance to live near Negroes. Far from it. He is proud of Louisville's progress towards integration, but he is worried about the value of his property. And you know, of course, what happens to property values when a Negro family moves to an all-white block? So he's selling now to get his price while the getting is good. Depending on the neighborhood, he may or may not be willing to sell to Negroes. The choice is all his, and will be until Louisville passes an open housing ordinance to eliminate skin color as a factor in the buying and selling of homes. Such an ordinance is already in the planning stage. Meanwhile, the homeowner who will sell to Negroes is a rare bird, except in the West End, and arguments are presented with the great feeling that those who will show their homes only to whites are not prejudiced, merely considerate of their neighbors. Personally, I have nothing against colored people, a seller will explain, but I don't want to hurt the neighbors. If I sold my house to a Negro, it would knock several $1,000s off the value of every house on the block. Most Negro realtors deny this, citing the law of supply and demand. Good housing for Negroes is scarce, they point out, and prices are consequently higher than those on the white market where demand is not so heavy. There are, however, both white and Negro real estate speculators who engage in block busting. They will work to place a Negro in an all-white block, then try to scare the other residents into selling cheap. Quite often they succeed, then resell to Negroes at a big profit. According to Jesse P. Warders, a real estate agent and a longtime leader in Louisville's Negro community, what this town needs is a single market for housing, not two like we have now. Warders is counting on an open housing ordinance, and he maintains that the biggest obstacle to open housing without an ordinance is the lack of Negroes on Louisville's real estate board. In order to be a realtor in Louisville, a real estate agent has to be a member of the board, the real estate board, which does not accept Negroes, and Warders is a member of the Washington-based National Institute of Real Estate Brokers, which has about as much influence here as the French Foreign Legion. Louisville, like other cities faced with urban decay, has turned to the building of midtown apartments as a means of luring suburbanites back to the city center. And the newest and biggest of these, called the 800, Warders tried to place a Negro client. The reaction was a good indicator of the problems facing Negroes after they break the barrier of outright racism. Do me a favor, the builder of the 800 told Warders, let me get the place 50% full. That's my break-even point. Then I'll rent to your client. Warders was unhappy with the rebuff, but he believes the builder will eventually rent to Negroes, and that he thinks is real progress. What should I say to the man, he asked. I know for a fact that he's refused some white people too. What the man wants is prestige tenants. He'd like to have the mayor living in his place. He'd like to have the president of the board of aldermen. Hell, I'm in business too. I might not like what he says, but I see his point. Warders has been in the firing long enough to know the score. He is convinced that fear of change and the reluctance of most whites to act in any way that might be frowned on by the neighbors is the Negroes' biggest problem in Louisville. I know how they feel, and so do most of my clients, but do you think it's right? The 800 was built with the considerable help of an FHA guaranteed loan, Federal Housing Administration, which places the building automatically in the open housing category. Furthermore, the owner insists that he is colorblind on the subject of tenants, but he assumes nonetheless that the prestige tenants he wants would not consider living in the same building with Negroes. It is the same assumption that motivates a homeowner to sell to whites only, not because of race prejudice, but out of concern for property values. In other words, almost nobody has anything against Negroes, but everybody's neighbors does. In other words, almost nobody has anything against Negroes, but everybody's neighbor does. This is galling to the Negroes. Simple racism is an easy thing to confront, but a mixture of guilty prejudice, economic worries, and threatened social standing is much harder to fight. If all the white people I've talked to had the courage of their convictions, one Negro leader has said, we wouldn't have a problem here. Louisville's lending institutions frustrate Negroes in the same way. Frank Stanley Jr. claims that there's a gentleman's agreement among bankers to prevent Negroes from getting mortgages to buy homes in white neighborhoods. The complaint would seem to have certain validity, although once again less sinister explanations are offered. The lending agencies cite business reasons, not race prejudice, as a reason for their concern. Concern for the reaction of their depositors seem to be a big factor, and another is the allegation that such loans would be of poor risk, especially if the institution holds mortgages on other homes in the neighborhood. Here again is a fear of falling property values. Hunter S. Thompson on Louisville.